Welcome to Sleepy History Tales. If you're listening to this in the dead of night, please tell me where you are and what time it is. There's something comforting about knowing that we, the silent watchers of buried history, are still here, silently observing stories that should never be allowed to come to life. And if you're willing, follow me into a hidden room where everything we believe to be medical truth was called into question on a gloomy morning in 1832 in Vienna. In 1832, an anonymous body was brought to the anatomy lecture hall at Vienna General Hospital. A teenage girl, no name, no relatives, and presumed to have died of typhoid fever. But when her chest was opened, 6 students stood there stunned. One collapsed. Another left the university that night. Beneath her thin skin was not the usual anatomical structure, but a second nervous system. Perfect, symmetrical, intact to the very core. Her records were sealed within days. The morgue burned. And by the end of the month, no one dared to mention her name again. This is the story of the girl with 2 nervous systems and the institutions that silently erased her existence signature by signature. It was a light rain that morning. The kind of sad early spring rain sneaking through the stone grooves, dripping along the edges of the hospital walls. The anatomy lecture hall was carefully scrubbed, the smell of alcohol and gas lingering in the air. Students gathered around the operating table under the flickering gaslights. The girl couldn't have been more than 17. Slender, pale, as anonymous as the other corpses that had come to this place. Her hair had been shaved. There was no sign of injury or disease on her scalp. The identification card simply read, "Female suspected of typhoid fever. Died March 10. No relatives, no attending physician. Only a city stamp and a faint signature from the morgue." Anton Weiss, a sophomore, was the first to notice something was wrong. When he touched her wrist while preparing the instruments, he felt a strange warmth. Her skin was not cold like a corpse's, but rather feverish, like someone in a deep sleep during an illness. He said nothing. None of them said anything. Even in Vienna, where science was considered a sacred ritual, medical students understood that there were things that should be left alone in the body, not spoken of. Dr. Elias Krantz entered 15 minutes late, as was his custom. His gloves were slightly damp, his voice absent, as he directed the students to begin the chest incision. One held the rib cage, another made the first cut just below the collarbone. And then the sound began. Not exactly a sound. It was a vibration. It traveled from the table to the stone floor, from the floor to the boots, and into the soles of the feet. A quiet vibration like an echo from somewhere else, but no one said anything. The girl's chest opened. No odor, no bulge, no signs of decomposition. And then they saw it. Beneath the normal nervous and vascular systems was a second system. Dimmer, deeper, but perfectly symmetrical, clear and intact, like a silent copy embroidered under the fabric. No one in the room dared to speak. One man stepped back, tripping. Another dropped his scalpel. Anton looked toward Dr. Krantz, expecting an explanation, but he stood motionless, eyes wide, staring, not at the body, but at the space behind it, as if trying to turn the pages of an anatomy book in his head. Finally, he whispered, "Don't touch the spine." Not yet. The operation ended abruptly. No explanation. The girl was taken away. The instruments were sterilized in silence. No lecture, no roll call, no mention of that morning. That same night, Anton returned to the lecture hall saying he had forgotten his gloves. The body was gone. By the operating table was a sink and a freshly changed cloth. On the blackboard, there was only one word left in chalk, very faint and hastily erased. Bilateral. Anton didn't ask. Not the next day, not the following week, but he began to search the morgue files every night. And 2 days later, when the fire burned down the entire east wing of the hospital, he knew exactly what would never be found. Her and anything that proved she had ever existed. Are you still here? Leave a comment with the country and time you're viewing. Because sometimes, knowing you're not alone in your search for intentionally buried memories is enough to make the darkness less scary. After that morning, they never saw each other again, at least not as a group. Not in the lecture hall, not in the hospital hallway. Not again. By the end of the month, one had moved to Heidelberg. One had withdrawn from medical school altogether. The remaining 4 remained in Vienna. But none of them pursued anatomy. One had switched to obstetrics. One had disappeared from the student records as if he had never existed. Their names appeared only briefly scattered in the margins of faculty lists and old roll calls. Yusef Ehl, Anton Weiss, Will Helmkraft, Emil Kuss. The other 2, Friedrich Roma and Otto Landel, left no record of that morning. But the oral histories survived. Hidden in the margins of books in a few sealed letters, found later in the basement of the Josephinum Library. Anton's memoirs, as detailed as a confession. Only Anton had ever spoken the truth in clear words. Decades later, in a private letter, never sent, he wrote, "It was a system behind a system. The body seemed to have been sketched twice, and only the first drawing was allowed to be seen. The dissection had ended as soon as the chest was opened, but in those few minutes, they had all seen it. Underneath the usual brachial nerve roots, a second network was entwined like rope. Thinner, paler, but clearly purposeful. Not chaotic repetition. It was architecture. Helmkraft described it as woven. The nerves folded back through the muscles and tendons, like threads embroidered in fabric. Roma, he said, had left the operating table when they reached the cervical region. He later said, "The spine has divided its intention." The statement was never explained, but was repeated verbatim by another classmate years later. The division was not subtle. It began at the second thoracic vertebra, where the spine split one branch curving slightly to the left, the other symmetrically to the right. Not a deformity. It was designed. Dr. Elias Krantz made no record of the moment. The blackboard remained blank. His leather notebook lay by the sink, still closed. When questioned later, he would only say that the students had misunderstood the shadows or that the gaslight had confused the anatomical image. But one student remembered clearly, the lights were off before the chest opened. There was only the pale natural light of early morning. No shadows were deep enough to make out the tightly braided nerves that ran down the hips like ribbons. 2 days after the operation, Professor Fat, the second person present, suddenly resigned. No reason given. His office was cleared the following week. His name was erased from the entire semester calendar. His colleagues later called him an early retiree, but no pension records were kept. Anton was still haunted by one detail, something no one else seemed to notice. The second nerve. It was not the same shade as the main one. Where the normal nerve was a dull ivory color, the second had a dull coating, as if dipped in white chalk. Not glowing, not supernatural, just out of place, not belonging. In 1836, a Basel medical journal published an anonymous article describing a symmetrical spinal impression seen during an operation in Vienna. The article was not cited. Less than a year later, the journal was withdrawn. The publisher cited a binding error. No photographs were taken. The daguerreotype had not yet appeared in Viennese medical institutions, and so only the account remains. Years later, a student's sketchbook was found in a private collection in Prague, unsigned. The paper was rotten and fragile. One page showed a spine split in two at the base, running in two directions, like a mirror image. Underneath the drawing were the words, "Do not record, do not repeat." They saw it, and they all lived as if they had never seen anything. Dr. Elias Kranz's desk sat in the corner of the anatomical archives. A polished walnut tabletop drawers neatly labeled in handwriting too meticulous to belong to a surgeon. His colleagues called him too careful to the point of being insensitive. He took notes. He spoke in Latin during surgery. And he always stamped every report within 24 hours. Which makes it all the more strange that after that March operation, no new entries appeared under his name in the hospital's official archives. If you're still here, you're among the few who dare to touch something that history itself has tried to forget. Leave a comment. Where are you watching and what time is it? The anatomical record. A thick leather-bound book carefully maintained since 1792 was suddenly completely blank from March 3 to 8. In the margin of that week, written in faded pencil and later erased, was the only note left. C. Personal Diary EK. Dr. Kranz's personal sketchbook was not kept at home. Like most staff at the Vienna General Hospital, he kept sensitive documents in a locked cabinet beneath the lectern, opened by a simple brass key worn on a leather strap around his neck. The same key also opened the rare specimen cabinet of the adjacent anatomical library. When Anton Weiss returned under the pretext of looking for his gloves, he found that the cabinet door was not completely closed. It was not propped open, but it was no longer locked. The lock was slightly dented, as if someone had used an inappropriate tool to pry it open. Inside was the professor's sketchbook ravaged. Some pages had been torn, roughly not carefully disassembled, but torn so that the edges were as frayed as a stripped python's skin. A few pages had been cut across with a sharp object, as if someone had slashed through the drawing with a scalpel in a fit of impatience. The remaining fragments were irregular, a cross-section of the thorax, the curve of the female pelvis, then an incomplete diagram of the spine stopping halfway at the lumbar region. The last legible line written in Kranz's own ink read, "Second plexus begins caudally in the spine. The anterior curve appears to be autonomous." And then the end. No punctuation, no conclusion, just a broken line of ink. The next page was blank. Below, a faint imprint remained, like the pressure echo of a hurried pen stroke, where someone had tried to continue writing, but then erased it or torn it away. What remained was a mirror image of the writing, hard to read, as if the writer did not want to understand it himself later. The night watchman in the ward later said he saw Kranz standing alone in the anatomy lecture hall, silently in front of the blackboard, one hand on the cloth-covered stretcher where the girl had been. He stood there for nearly an hour, not moving. The next morning, when asked, Krantz denied it. He had not returned after class. The only thing he submitted to the faculty committee was not a report. It was a request for temporary medical leave citing severe sleep disturbance. His language was clinical cold, but between the lines was an indescribable tremor not present in his old documents. The request was approved, no return date. When a young assistant tried to update the MR girl's medical records in Krantz's absence, he was stopped. The records were not completed. There was only a straight line across the page, crossed out forever. A red wax seal had been stamped in the margin, not from the hospital, but from the Ministry of Science and Teaching. In 1842, 10 years after the event, a parcel from an unknown sender was donated to the Josephinum archives. Inside were 6 loose pages apparently taken from a medical sketchbook. The ink had faded. Rainwater had eroded much of the detail, but one drawing remained, a spine drawn twice. The first time in bold strokes, the second time in faint dashes below, mirrored symmetrically like an anatomical ghost. There was no author's name, no title, only a small note stuck to the envelope, and not to be published. If found, returned to the Krantz estate. But the Krantz legacy had been wiped out since 1837. His estate burned to the ground. Cause unknown. The fire was strange, so quiet that no one noticed it. The fire began in the early hours of the morning. No one could agree on the exact time. When the hospital janitor spotted the smoke from the east wing, the bell tower clock had just struck 6. The smoke was thin at first, slipping close to the ground like morning mist. Not violent, requiring no alarm, just a cool, steady breath like from an unclosed chimney. Harmless until it wasn't. The fire left no outward trace, but inside, absolute ruin. The morgue was at the lowest part of the hospital grounds, almost underground. Vaulted ceilings kept cool and quiet. Brick structure with slate roof, iron doors. No burn marks on the outside. No broken windows. No chemical residue. And yet, when the firefighters broke down the door to get inside, the entire interior was blackened from floor to ceiling. File cabinets were twisted. Examination tables were disjointed. Copper sinks were peeled like fruit skin. The flames had not touched the outside. The walls were still standing. Cool to the touch. If you're reading this, you're stepping deep into something that was once buried under the ashes of conventional medicine. Leave a comment. Where are you from and what time is it? We're listening. The official report, as drafted by hospital steward Lent, used a phrase so strangely modern it seemed misplaced in its century, internal combustion of unknown source. The term felt mechanical, industrial, even prophetic. When questioned, Lent hesitated. That language, he admitted, had not been his. A faculty member had suggested it. He would not or could not say which. But what was lost that night could not be summarized by language alone. It was more than scorched timber and warped brass. The body. The girl tagged only as Mr. was never found, nor were her instruments. Gone too were her tissue slides, her dissection tools and the surgical implements last recorded in use during her final procedure. The specimen jars housed beside her station had shattered each one, but the parchment labels remained fluttering slightly in the draft. Every name on every shelf was still legible, except hers. Her space bore no label, no debris, no glass dust, only a faint circle of black soot where her jar had once stood. Of all the hospital staff on duty, only one had been assigned to the eastern wing that night, a morgue attendant named Thomas Huber. He survived the fire, but his memory of the event was gone. In his statement, he recalled slipping out just before sunrise to relieve himself behind the stable yards. When he returned, something was wrong. The handle to the dissection room door scalded his palm. The burn was real, clearly documented, inked into his employee file. But his clothes untouched. Not a scorch mark on them. The medical board dismissed him a week later for dereliction of duty. But the deeper contradiction remained. How could a fire hot enough to melt brass leave behind no visible plume? The university tower, only a few yards away, had full view of the east wing. Junior clerks were known to begin morning records there precisely at 5 a.m. Yet, no smoke was logged until nearly 2 hours later. Decades afterward, in an anonymous confession, one of those clerks came forward. He had seen the smoke. He admitted it. But he didn't raise the alarm. When asked why his response was strangely subdued, it didn't feel like mine to question. No formal investigation followed. 2 days later, the board declared the incident contained and non-replicable. Insurance claims were processed with surprising speed. Rebuilding began by April, but then during the cleanup, something strange surfaced beneath the charred wreckage. A half-melted brass nameplate recovered from the cold chamber door. It bore no name, no engraving, just blank metal. Yet under magnification, something emerged, a pattern. Not words, not symbols, but shallow scratches worn into the surface over time. According to the university archivist, the lines formed what appeared to be nerve pathways, spinal tracings drawn twice. Not etched by human hands, but impressed into the plate as if from pressure. He kept it in his drawer, wrapped in muslin. 3 months later, it was stolen. The drawer had not been forced. The lock had not been picked. Nothing else was missing, and no one ever replaced it. Above the dissection theater stood a boardroom. It had no windows, built that way by design. Long before electric lights, long before medical oversight softened into public scrutiny. The ceiling, a low arch of yellowed plaster, was rimmed with molding stained from decades of varnish and ash. No portraits hung, no plaques. Only a single crooked crucifix mounted near the back. On the morning of March 10th, 8 members of the Vienna Medical Board gathered there. They had been summoned quietly. No agenda circulated. No stenographer attended. The meeting was entered into the university ledger under a vague header, Emergency Anatomical Review. Beneath that line, written in a darker ink, was a notation. Subject MR0302132. Dr. Elias Krantz arrived first. He carried nothing. No files, no charts, not even a briefcase. The others followed. Rectors, surgeons, anatomists, 2 observers from the Ministry of Science. They nodded, but no one spoke. At the center of the table sat a pool of sealing wax already melted. The chair a man named Breichner entered last. Instead of lighting the oil lamp, he struck a match and let its flame dip into the wax. He did not explain. No one asked. The implication was clear. Nothing spoken here would be recorded. Kranz was asked one question. Was the anomaly confirmed by your direct observation? He answered simply, yes. No elaboration requested. None offered. Then came a second question from one of the ministry's delegates. Was it replicated or further examined following the initial incision? Kranz paused not long, just a second longer than comfort allowed. No, he said. The examination was left incomplete. No final notes, no summary, no testimony. And then, as if on cue, the vote began, without motion, without debate. 8 slips of paper each folded, once dropped wordlessly into a tin dish at the center of the table. No one spoke. No names were read. No eyes were met. Dr. Bruckner read them aloud one by one. All 8 seal. No medical rationale, no written conclusion, no report filed. The decision did not pass through the University Council. It was never entered into the anatomical register. The case, such as it had existed, simply ceased and would now remain so. Within the hour, the wax seals were melted. A single file folder, plain manila, marked only with the initials MR, was closed and sealed on all edges. A courier from the ministry archive was waiting in the vestibule. He signed no receipt. His name wasn't logged. The folder has never surfaced again. Only one voice rose in protest, though not within the room. The following morning, a resignation letter was delivered by hand to the hospital registrar. Dr. Lucas Hiltz, 61 years of service, wrote plainly, I cannot participate in the erasure of data observed in good faith. His note was neither emotional nor angry, just quiet, final, measured. 6 days later, Dr. Hiltz was found dead in his quarters. The official cause, cardiac failure in sleep, natural, unremarkable. But among the porters and junior clerks, murmurs spread. Something felt unfinished. His final meal sat untouched. His shoes were placed evenly beneath his bed. His journal was open, but the page was blank, except for a single piece of red thread from the ceiling folded 3 times. No funeral was held. Before the year's end, the board met again to appoint his replacement. Dr. Hiltz's name was not spoken. When roll was called, his chair was passed over as if it had never been occupied. The new member was sworn in. No oath was given. The crucifix in the boardroom still hung crooked. Watching. Always watching. It would resurface again, briefly, quietly, years later. Spring of 1847. A slender monograph appeared bound in dull grey linen, printed privately. Its title, On Instances of Peripheral Symmetry in Spinal Nerve Structure, filed under Miscellaneous Physiology at the Medical University of Leipzig. There was no author biography, just a single name, Avaz. For 2 weeks, it went unnoticed. But those who did find it, those who read closely, recognized something strange. The opening pages referenced an observed case during the 1832 Vienna semester. No names, no institutions. The tone was defensive, almost apologetic. It described a cadaver exhibiting mirrored nerve formations beneath the spinal cord, a phrase repeated exactly 4 times across 21 pages. No diagrams, no claims, no journal citations, just questions, quiet ones. And yet, those who read it understood. Or rather, they remembered. Within the Leipzig faculty, a single professor recalled the name Wass, or rather Weiss, Anton Weiss, a student of Kranz. one of the 6 men present that cold March morning. Weiss had graduated quietly, moved to a small district near Graz. Never published before? Never again. Within 4 days, the monograph disappeared. Not reviewed, not debated, just removed. The librarian's ledger noted it, withdrawn at faculty request. No signature, no form. One copy was mailed to Vienna, it never arrived. Another was sent under seal to the Josephinum. When opened, the paper inside was blank. In Leipzig, the printer who had prepared the original run was questioned. He remembered the author. Said he had brought his own typeset, not uncommon for private physicians. What struck him was the insistence: burn the excess sheets immediately. Only 4 copies printed, no remainders. By the time archivists in Vienna tried to locate Anton Weiss, his name no longer appeared on the Graz physician rolls. Letters went unanswered. His address empty. One colleague remembered Weiss attending a symposium on comparative anatomy the year before. Said he left early, polite, distracted, quiet. Only 1 copy of the monograph is known to survive. It resides in Zurich, in a private anatomical collection, restricted, uncatalogued, not available to the public. Those few researchers who've seen it offer only vague recollections, peripheral anomalies, nervous irregularities, spinal bifurcations observed, but never officially recorded. The final page was left blank. Not torn, not forgotten. Just unmarked, like a breath held far too long, waiting for release that never came. Some have whispered that the paper was never meant for public eyes at all. That it was a record, yes, but not for publication. Not for the scholars, the doctors, the medical journals gathering dust in Austrian libraries. It was a message for them, the others. The ones who had stood beside the table in 1832 and witnessed something that didn't belong in anatomy or vocabulary. In a faded faculty journal kept in Leipzig, a margin note was found beside a routine lecture schedule dated April 17, 1847. The handwriting was hurried, almost anxious. Vast paper pulled, asked no questions, said nothing untrue. No formal investigation followed. There was no scandal, no retraction. But that wasn't entirely true, because later that year, the anatomy department in Vienna quietly received a memo from the Ministry of Instruction. It mentioned no names, no author, no specifics. It simply offered a stern reminder. Any anatomical anomaly lacking reproducible precedent must not be published. The final line was underlined twice. Let Vienna remain Vienna. After that, no further monographs appeared. And Anton Weiss? He was never heard from again. In the hospital ledger, she was entered with no surname. Only an initial Emma, no real name, no known relatives, a guessed year of birth, date of death March 2nd, 1832. She was labeled as an unclaimed female cadaver. Cause of death presumed typhus. No attending physician, no listed parish of origin. But the handwriting that filled her line on the intake form, it was different. Tighter, more deliberate. Like someone was copying from something else, or looking at something just out of sight. And when the morgue registrar cross-referenced her body, catalogued under cadaver number 427, he found something he shouldn't have. A second entry, dated 1 day earlier, But this time, not Mimsa. It read MK. Same age, same gender, same cadaver number, same date of arrival, but a different certificate of death. One bore the official seal of Vienna's 6th district, the other, the 4th. Both were authentic. Both were filed within 48 hours of each other. The ministry was notified discreetly. Their response: they sent both certificates back, unmarked. No notes, just a single slip of parchment unsigned. Retain both, destroy neither, do not merge. In the weeks that followed, the anatomy students began whispering again. They remembered the red tag tied to her wrist, barely visible under the linen sheet. It had clearly read MK, but the docket filed by Dr. CR listed her as Mr. No one dared ask, not out loud, because no one wanted to be the first to wonder aloud if a body could carry two histories. Or worse, two authors. Records from her supposed residence, the boarding house on Ringstrasse, still exist. Neatly bound in cracked leather, stored now in a forgotten city archive. The ledger from February that year contains a single entry for dormitory wing B, bed 3, M count. No arrival, no departure, just a name, slanted letters, sharp downward strokes, a touch, ornate. The house matron at the time, Frau Margarita Duhn, never reported a guest of that name. No mention of illness, no conduct issues, no burial, nothing. When questioned under oath years later, during an unrelated fraud investigation, she admitted, "I do not recall a girl of that name, that handwriting. It wasn't from any guest or staff I ever knew." 8 other women were staying in Wing B that month. 5 gave statements. None recalled her. One remembered the bed had remained empty. Another swore it had briefly belonged to a dental apprentice from Brno. But that apprentice, when located, insisted she had never been to Vienna in her life. The room itself was unremarkable. Iron-framed bed, a cracked basin, one shuttered window facing the alley. Years later, when the floorboards were lifted for plumbing, repair workers found something wedged between the joists beneath the bed frame, a rolled scrap of linen. No name, no blood. Only a grey smudge like damp parchment had bled its ink into the fabric. Letters, reversed, unreadable, but human. In the years that followed, both initials MR and MK would appear again in different archives. Hospital notes, faculty memoranda, archived communications, always separate, never together. And that is where the trail ends, or maybe it doesn't. Because in Vienna, as they used to say behind closed doors, what disappears is only what is allowed to. And sometimes what's allowed to vanish still leaves fingerprints behind. The dissection ledger bore a single set of initials MR, written in Kranz's distinct angular script. But the cold storage registry, it listed MK penned in someone else's careful hand. The boarding house ledger confirmed an MK had stayed there that winter, yet when the body was finally released from the morgue, the certificate named Mimsta. 2 names, 1 body. The ministry's records preserved both identifiers. Neither was authenticated. When a senior administrator reviewed the file in 1864, he scrawled a chilling summary in the margin. 1 subject, 2 names. No origin, duplicate form, original source unknown, And below that, in a second hand, more delicate, almost resigned, she was never claimed because she was never given. Nearly half a century later, in the autumn of 1883, a local carpenter was hired to refit the archives wing of the Josephinum Medical Museum in Vienna. One of his tasks was to remove a warped oak desk, an imposing dust-choked relic from the office of the late Dr. Elias Krantz. The desk had stood untouched for decades, preserved more out of superstition than protocol. No one had used it since Krantz's abrupt and silent retirement. It took 2 men to move it. The drawer rails, swollen with time, resisted every pull. When they finally pried open the lowest drawer, they noticed a narrow gap beneath the baseboard, just wide enough for a small object to slip through and vanish. Inside, wedged between wood and silence, was a single envelope. It was yellowed and dry, the seams brittle. The handwriting across the front was unmistakably Krantz's. It read, "To be forwarded upon verification of findings." There was no name, no address, no institution listed, no return mark, and curiously it had never been sealed. The flap was curled from age and moisture, but showed no residue of wax or glue, no sign it had ever been closed at all. As if the writer had intended to send it, then hesitated, stopped mid-thought. Inside was a single sheet of thick rag paper, the kind used for private letters, not institutional records. It was dated March 6, 1832, 4 days after the girl's dissection. 4 days before the fire that destroyed the East Wing. The handwriting wasn't like Krantz's usual notes, no dense medical shorthand, no anatomical sketches. Just 5 paragraphs. Slow, measured, haunted. There is an order we follow, not out of faith, but necessity. Symmetry as we know it governs the physical, the functional, the knowable. But this what I have seen is symmetry of a different nature. Krantz's pen grew heavier, mid-sentence. The ink pooled slightly in the dips of the page, not structural, not pathological. Something closer to mimicry but not learned, not copied. It is as though the body received a second draft fully committed, laid beside the first with no attempt to reconcile the two. There was a pause. Then a subtle tremble in the next line, like the hand had faltered. I cannot yet determine whether this duplication was passive, something dormant waiting, or active, an intention folded into her from the beginning. Then came the line that would puzzle historians for generations. What troubles me is not the presence of the mirrored system, but its completeness. It knew where to stop. It obeyed laws we have not written. Anatomical symmetry beyond God's design. There was no signature, no closing line, just a comma, and then a faint smear where the pen must have paused. Below it, a blot shaped like a fingertip dragging slowly toward the edge. There were no further drafts, no carbon copy, just that one page. The envelope held nothing else, no stamp, no seal from the ministry, no proof it had ever left the drawer. So what happened next? The carpenter turned the envelope over to a young archivist. Dutifully, he catalogued it under unsent correspondence, miscellaneous. That drawer, however, was reassigned a month later. The letter was never seen again. But in 1891, a curious footnote surfaced in a limited print monograph by a Czech medical historian. The footnote quoted sections of Kranz's letter, almost verbatim, citing it as taken from a discarded document, provenance uncertain. The monograph was privately published. It reached only a few hands. No one publicly challenged the citation. Most scholars assumed it was apocryphal, just another legend built around Kranz after his withdrawal from public life. And yet, in the museum's internal ledger, one faint accession number still appears, EK032L. It reads, "Unposted letter, found with draw lining, retained for review." Beside it, in a later annotation, someone wrote, "Language inconsistent with scientific correspondence. Tone suggestive of observation, not meant for dissemination." No follow-up was recorded. No investigation launched. Just a letter that should never have existed, discovered too late and forgotten by design. The drawer was relined. The desk sold without comment. And deep within the back pages of a slim, privately printed auction ledger, something strange was listed. Just 4 lines. 4 lines of ink that very nearly disappeared among outdated surgical texts and dusty portraits of long-dead university deans. Lot 47. Anonymous Anatomical Folio, Sagora, 1830s. Partial renderings, ink with graphite overlay. No provenance. That winter in Prague, 1891, an auction was held inside a converted printing house. Not many came. The air was heavy with ink and mildew. Most who attended were former faculty, disconnected from their institutions but not from their obsessions. Men with titles no longer used and reputations they carried like dust on old coats. Lot 47 was purchased by a physician from Moravia. He paid in coin. Left No Name took the folio under one arm and departed before the final item was even announced. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 years later, the drawings resurfaced. Quietly. At a private gathering of comparative anatomists in Zurich, the folio contained 6 plates. 5 of them were what you'd expect incomplete studies of the female thoracic and lumbar regions. Inconsistent in quality. Unremarkable. But the sixth was something else. It showed a full spinal column extended and rendered in sepia ink. Standard enough. But beneath it, beneath the spinal cord itself, there lay another network, a second structure, fainter, mirrored. Drawn in graphite, it traced the same path, but in reverse. And though it was lighter, the lines were confident, deliberate, not a draft, not a teaching aid, but something remembered, something repeated. Someone had come to this page after the ink had dried, had picked up graphite and added their own memory of what lay beneath. No labels, no scale, no notes. Just that peculiar symmetry, one system layered atop another like shadow and soul. If you looked closely, you'd see deviations, small ones. Loops that didn't follow standard neurology, but did follow something. They weren't mistakes, they were echoes. One rendered from observation. The other, it seems, from memory, and not the same memory. Because forensic analysis years later, in 1904, would show by polarized light and early photographic techniques that the graphite wasn't a mechanical tracing. It deviated by millimeters. It bent at slightly different angles. This was not imitation. It was recreation. Different pressure marks in the paper confirmed it a second hand. Someone who had seen the original, perhaps briefly. Someone who knew the shape of the truth, but not where it belonged. The only annotation across all 6 drawings was a tiny, near invisible note in the margin of the last page. Observe, but do not confirm. The Zurich anatomists, disturbed or perhaps simply bewildered, declined to publish the drawings. One of them quietly offered to store the folio in his private archive. He labeled it Aberrant Structures Non-Traumatic and filed it in a cabinet alongside classified anatomical anomalies. Years passed. When that drawer was opened again, the folder remained. But the drawings were gone. No record of their removal. No visitors logged. The label untouched. A new folder was added in its place, but nothing else was said. The archivist simply wrote, "Original assumed misfiled or reclaimed." Meanwhile, the Prague ledger still exists, still lists Lot 47. A faint line drawn through it just once in graphite. No name recorded, no initials, just a price circled once with a strange notation written in a different hand beneath. X4.22, recalled before correction. And in the background of all this, the Journal of the Imperial Academy. In Vienna Anatomic Studien, never missed an issue. Uniform, meticulous month after month since 1805, except for one, March 1832. That issue never appeared. Not in Vienna's bound volumes, not in the city's archives, not in any known collection. It is the only gap in an otherwise perfect record. Did you catch that, listener? The missing issue, the mirrored spine, the graphite that remembered differently. You don't need to believe anything yet, just observe. But do not confirm. The February 1832 issue ended quietly on page 218. The April issue began without introduction on page 253. No explanation, no editor's note, no erratum. Just a 34-page void. It wasn't uncommon in that era for journals to feature minor inconsistencies. A misaligned page count might be attributed to printing quirks or delays. But this wasn't that. No one noticed the anomaly at first. Academic journals then weren't combed through like scripture. They were glanced, shelved, forgotten. That is until 1875, when a graduate student at the Viennese Academy, tasked with cataloguing the bound volumes, caught the gap. It seemed routine enough, and so he filed a correction request with the Academy's archivist. The archivist, thorough in his habits, retrieved the original print ledgers from 1832. Most were dry-as-dust logistics inventory orders. But one notation under March stood out: Plate 6 warped. Replaced by request. No signature, no indication of who made the request, and no mention of what Plate 6 even was. Now plates did warp during storage. That much was true. The gelatinized impressions of anatomical prints were delicate and prone to temperature shifts. Replacements were expensive, but censorship was rare. Still, something about the phrasing was too vague. And then came the second problem. The register listed no replacement. Not one of the preserved Viennese copies across 3 institutions contained Plate 6 for March. In fact, none of them contained anything from March at all. An inquiry was sent across the border to Basel, Switzerland, where a handful of Vienna's older journal volumes had been donated in the 1850s. There at the university library, a dusty volume did contain the March 1832 issue. Or so it claimed. The table of contents listed 6 articles, but only 5 were present. The 6th listed cryptically as on unclassified symmetric tracing in spinal formation. Submitted by Dr. E.K. No title page, no content. The page where it should have begun had been cut, not torn, not damaged, sliced. A clean surgical excision from spine to margin, executed with a fine scalpel. The kind of cut that leaves no fraying, no uneven edges. Curiously, the binding thread was undisturbed, suggesting the removal had happened before final binding. No hint of clumsy hands, no sign of mistake. This had been intentional. On the flyleaf, a faint inscription read, "Gifted by Vienna Medical Office, 1854. But there was no export form, no accession paperwork, just a ghost. Years later, in 1901, another copy was located in Strasbourg. That volume too lacked plate 6, but under strong lamplight, something odd emerged. The signature code typically printed deep in the page. Gutter was partially visible beneath the overlay. Someone had printed the page number but not the content. The plate had not been excluded. It had been covered, and for some reason, no one was allowed to see it. Historians, of course, began to speculate. Perhaps plate 6 was more than just a misprint. Perhaps it slipped through editorial unnoticed, added in secret by Dr. Kranz himself, or submitted under institutional seal before the March 1832 vote to seal the case entirely. Then came the Zurich incident. In 1912, a private anatomical collector listed an unbound plate 6 for sale. The description was vague, restricted to vetted parties, and the item was never displayed publicly. Within 2 weeks, the listing vanished. The dealer later claimed the plate had been reclaimed by original party. He would not say who. When pressed, he ended all communication. Shortly after, when an Austrian academic requested comment from the Viennese Academy regarding the March issue, the official reply was curt and polished. The archives contain no record of any anomaly. A month later, the February 1832 volume in the bound archive was updated. One correction: hand-pinned. March 1832. Pages withheld for duplication error. To be revised. But no revision followed. No reprint emerged. No explanation came. All that remained was a blank entry, and the initials EK faint and fading into dust. It was not until 1902 that someone made a formal attempt to unravel the mystery. Not a doctor, not a scholar, but a legal historian researching sealed autopsy cases from the Austro-Hungarian Ministry of Instruction. He had a specific method. He cross-referenced ledger entries sealed with wax and catalogued for suppression patterns. In one crumbling memo from 1832, almost illegible under mold and decay, he found a line no one else had documented. Directive issued. Mr. Record to remain internal. Origin anatomical irregularity. March term. The historian submitted a request for full access to the file. 5 business days later, a typed letter arrived from the Central Vienna Archive. It was brief, polite, and final. No such case exists in the formal record. References to MR are understood to be apocryphal. No further research advised. No name was attached. He pressed again, this time including documentation of Kranz's confirmed faculty record and citing the coincidental destruction of the university morgue that same week in 1832. He received a second letter, this time from a ministry liaison. It was colder. The case is legend. No anatomical deviations occurred during spring 1832. This matter is closed. We'll pause here just for a breath, because if you're anything like me, dear listener, you're probably feeling what we've come to expect on this channel, the chill of not knowing what was real and what was forcibly made not to be. And we're not even halfway through. Let's keep going. The language was strikingly firm, sharper than expected. In the world of archives and academia, a little myth, a little mystery was often tolerated, sometimes even quietly treasured. Apocrypha had its place. But legend? That was a word reserved for fairy tales and folklore, not sealed records bearing official faculty stamps and formal documentation. And yet, there it was, dismissed as legend. The historian made a quiet note in his private journal. This wasn't mere rejection, it was deflection. A denial so broad, it refused to confront the actual claim. There was no correction, no debate, just an institutional shrug, a refusal to engage. But what unsettled him most was the silence. No trace of the inquiry remained, not in the archive's master log, not in the correspondence files. Neither his 2 written requests nor the replies appeared anywhere, vanished. The envelope from the ministry, once neatly filed under correspondence, E, was simply gone. The accession ledger for 1902 jumped a number. Request 174 skipped. Blank, a shadow. The historian ended his investigation the following year quietly. His observations survived only posthumously published in the footnotes of a dense volume titled Institutional Silences in European Scientific Communities. Even there, the Vienna case wasn't named. It was merely alluded to. Most library copies no longer have that page. And yet, the story lingered not in publications but in whispers, in late-night discussions in faculty salons, in old lecture halls where the marble still echoed with forgotten names. Among students of SAR, a peculiar phrase began to appear in the margins of notebooks and syllabi. The sealed girl. It wasn't an official label. It was shorthand. A quiet nod to cases that weren't safe to mention outright. A phrase used only with careful restraint. In 1907, a young professor of forensic anatomy scrawled it into the margins of a student's thesis feedback. Avoid sealed girl ambiguity. Establish pathology. When questioned, he laughed it off as an inside joke. But university correspondence later revealed he had privately inquired about early 1830s autopsy anomalies. He never got a reply. Within months, he resigned from the university and quietly took a post in Strasbourg. Mentions continued, but always obliquely. One in the margin of a draft dissertation. She was drawn twice. Another in a traveling pathologist's field notes. Vienna won't speak of March. It's not denial. It's arrangement. There were no retractions, no formal statements, just erasure. A vacuum where acknowledgement should have been. In 1911, the Academy issued a crisp statement reaffirming the completeness of its 19th century anatomical records. It reported no irregularities. A single line stood out. All known anomalies have been documented in accordance with institutional truth. Later, a silent archivist underlined 2 words in pencil. Known truth. No further comments were added, and the sealed girl she was never mentioned again. Officially, there was no institution, no operating budget, no faculty line item, no formal presence within the medical university records of Moravia. And yet, between 1895 and 1938 across Central Europe, professors and anatomists whispered of a small, unofficial circle, not based in Vienna, not even in Prague, but in Brno, a city known less for innovation than for its quiet, stubborn habit of preserving. They called themselves many things, but the term that would survive was this: scholars of anatomical nonconformity. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't even rebellion. Just a refuge, an underground network of displaced and retired anatomy lecturers who shared one quiet conviction: some truths could not be published. Not without consequence. Not in those times. They built a sanctuary beneath a borrowed library wing. No signs, no formal registry, just a wooden cabinet unlocked but unmapped. A simple iron handle, a brass plaque with 3 letters SIN. No one catalogued the files, no one spoke their names. You only accessed them if you already knew what to ask for. By 1922, the society had grown to house 112 case files. None marked with names, only numbers. The files came from everywhere. Paris, Berlin, Zagreb, Lviv. Sketches, testimonies, redacted letters, anomalies. Disturbing not for their chaos, but for their precision. Too detailed to dismiss as error. Too symmetrical to pass as accidents. But too wrong to be acknowledged as precedent. Most were incomplete, fragile, fragmentary. But they had patterns, repeating observations, mirrored distortions. The 73rd file was added in 1930, delivered by hand. A former archivist from the Josephinum arrived without announcement, carrying a small cloth-wrapped packet. He asked for nothing in return, signed it only with the initials FS. The label read bilateral axis. Inside were 3 items. The first, a faded duplicate of the disputed drawing plate, long believed to have originated in Vienna. It showed a female spinal cord splitting at the second thoracic vertebrae, diverging in mirrored pathways. Faint overlays had been penciled in a traced nervous system, reflecting itself across a hidden axis. The drawing bore no signature, but those who studied it closely couldn't mistake the hand behind it. It was Krantz, his early style, unmistakable, clean, unflinching, clinical to the point of discomfort, and entirely devoid of flourish or annotation, a kind of sterile honesty. The second item in the bundle was more troubling. A page of dissective commentary, also unsigned, dated only March 1832. The handwriting was uncertain words, leaning too far, the ink bleeding at intervals, as if the writer had paused mid-thought or mid-fear. One passage, written more darkly than the rest, read, "The second system does not echo the first. It anticipates it. Placement is preemptive, volition unknown." That word volition appeared nowhere else in the archive, as if invented for what the writer couldn't otherwise explain. The third item was an envelope, unsealed, unaddressed, inside a single scrap of ledger paper folded twice with a handwritten number 4027. Beneath it, in fading red ink, the initials MR. The number matched a cadaver entry in the morgue's 1832 log, a register presumed destroyed in the fire. But someone had recovered at least this part. The folio had been filed between Case 72, a triple femur specimen from Poland, and Case 74, a cranial inversion in a stillbirth from Marseille. No further materials were added to what became known quietly as the bilateral axis file. No one cited it officially. No one questioned its presence. And then, in 1944, the Sean cabinet vanished. Brno had fallen under occupation. The building that housed the anatomical collection was seized by military command. One night, without warning, the archives below were cleared under orders labeled Material Extraction, Medical Use, Official Inventory, listed standard supplies, microscopes, steel tools, vials. But not a single record mentioned the anatomical cabinet, the 1-12 rare cases, the sketches, the notes. All gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks. The cabinet had simply disappeared. Where it stood was now a patch of dust. In 1951, a Czech physician living in exile in Switzerland described something that caught historians off guard. He claimed to have seen a transit manifest just briefly at a train yard outside Berlin. The document bore the title File 73, Bilateral Axis. 2 days later, the entire car burned in what was called an unrelated incident. No copies of the manifest survived. His statement was recorded but never confirmed. That was the last anyone would claim to see the file. But one faint clue remained buried in pencil in the margin of the final archived registrar entry from Sean. Beside Case 73, a phrase was written, not destroyed, reclaimed, and then, in darker graphite, another line. Some anomalies erase themselves. This one chose not to. That could have been the end of the story. But if you've followed us this far, dear listener, you'll know history rarely ends where it should. In the spring of 2001, workers began renovations near the southeast corner of the former Vienna General Hospital. The hospital had long been decommissioned. Only a few administrative buildings remained. But the old morgue, its structure had been left untouched, a sunken courtyard framed by worn retaining walls. No signage, no visitors, just silence. The trenching project was simple clear a 2-meter path along an outdated drainage line. On the second day, a worker struck stone, but not brick, not pipe. What they found was a flat limestone slab, mortared tightly along its edges, angled strangely against the surrounding architecture. No blueprint marked it. No department claimed it. Construction halted. A preservation team was called in, followed by forensic archaeologists. The slab was removed by hand. Beneath it lay a hidden chamber, only 2 meters long, 1 meter across, and less than 70 centimeters deep. Not a tunnel, not a corridor, a pit, or maybe something older. Inside, human remains, scorched, fragmented, partially buried in soot and ash. The skull had collapsed inward, the long bones cracked along grain lines. The pattern matched exposure to intense uneven heat. Flash heat, but the vertebral column, oddly, was mostly intact. The remains were transferred to the University of Vienna's forensic lab, marked Case VU 0157. Initial tests placed them in the mid-19th century, likely tied to the 1832 fire. There were no coffin fragments, no grave markers, no sign of formal burial, just a body hidden beneath stone as if meant to be forgotten. And then came the anomaly. Graduate researcher Lena Kruger, assigned to the case reconstruction, was the first to notice it. While modeling the spine, she spotted something strange along the inner curvature of the thoracic vertebrae. Narrow furrows, almost too uniform to be accident. They weren't signs of decomposition. Not rodent damage, not congenital defects. Each groove, less than a millimeter wide and deep, ran parallel to the spinal canal. And the pattern was mirrored vertebra by vertebra. The team initially dismissed it as casting error, but Kruger persisted. When digitized and cross-referenced, the furrows formed a structure, a second pathway, thin, subtle, but deliberately carved into the bone. A second nervous system, or something trying to become one. The forensic report filed in October of that same year was clinical in tone, careful, detached, almost sterile. It described the anomalies as non-standard neural channels, possibly consistent with undocumented variation or post-inflammatory ossification. No conclusions were drawn, no speculation offered, just enough language to acknowledge something irregular without opening the door to anything uncomfortable. But something did change. 2 months later, the report was quietly amended. The digital scans gone, pulled from the archive with no explanation. The physical 3D models locked in a restricted cabinet. No formal notice, no disciplinary action, no clarification, just silence. The team who had worked on the case was given no reason, only new guidelines and an updated clearance tier. But one trace remained. A single grayscale image included in the draft of a graduate student's thesis before the amendment had taken effect. It depicted a partial spinal arch, the top of its ridge charred, warped as if from intense localized heat. Just beneath the main neural channel, a second channel curled in a pattern not found in any known medical literature. The caption read, "Unclassified paired neural trace. Subject VU0157. The thesis was never approved." The student left the program. Some say she was expelled, others that she simply disappeared. Later, when archivists tried to identify the remains, hoping to trace subject VU0157 through 19th century death records, they found only confusion. The cadaver number 4027, associated with the initials MR, had been destroyed in the morgue fire, a quiet archival disaster. No one had bothered to connect with the case. The body had never been officially buried. A second entry marked MK found in a Prague boarding house logbook was later flagged with a single line, "Removed from register. Cause unclear." Attempts to confirm identity through forensic DNA failed completely. The bone sample was too degraded without usable genetic markers. No familial matches, no biological leads. The case in the end was closed with a whisper. Anonymous. Female. Mid-adolescent. The remains were reburied. No plaque, no press. Just a narrow stone slab laid flush into a quiet courtyard, later paved over to make way for a faculty bicycle rack. But in the final forensic folder, tucked between faded charts and clinical notes, there was a handwritten message. Blue ink. It read, "A structure present, identity absent, pattern repeats." The word repeats had been underlined twice. And while the folio that started it, all the Prague anatomical volume, had always been treated as a curiosity, most assumed the faint graphite beneath the ink to be the work of a student. A ghost sketch. A warm-up. maybe a hesitant assistant trying to comprehend what they weren't trained to understand. But then came 2009. At the Schlegel Institute for Historical Anatomy, during a routine audit, the graphite overlay surfaced again, not through the hands of a doctor or a historian, but a handwriting analyst assigned to authenticate marginalia across a series of unsigned surgical texts from the 1800s. His name was Dr. Emil Harish. He wasn't looking for anomalies, but that's what he found. Plate 6, the mirrored spine, was different. Harish didn't focus on what the graphite showed, but how it had been drawn. The pressure distribution across the lines was unnatural. In some places, the pencil dug hard into the paper, particularly around the lumbar midsection, before tapering off like a hand adjusting too late. There were no guiding lines, no scaffold, no grid, no signs of the trained composure found in other medical illustrators of the era. This was not the hand of an anatomist. This was not the hand of someone who understood what they were seeing. It was someone trying urgently to trace, or maybe hide. Harish cross-referenced the graphite marks against a sample of over 60 known illustrations from the same era. The findings were not published. They were instead summarized in a restricted institutional memo. The graphite overlay, it concluded, was not the work of a trained medical practitioner, not a professional draftsman. Line pressure suggests unsteady, hand-inconsistent corrections, lack of anatomical knowledge. Tracer had visual access to the original, but not cognitive understanding. In simpler terms, whoever drew those graphite lines didn't want to learn from the image. They wanted to preserve it or distort it, and what they distorted was chilling. Upon closer review, Harish noticed that many of the labeled terms, standard anatomical markers like nerve groupings, vertebrae, and directional annotations had been altered. Not randomly, but strategically. For instance, cervical had become cervical, an odd phonetic substitution. Plexus overwritten as plexum, an archaic error that hadn't been in use since 1812. Most disturbingly, anterior had been fully inverted. It read Rotniner. At first, these were thought to be mistakes, typos. Perhaps an illiterate assistant copying what they didn't understand. But the substitutions were too specific, too targeted. They only affected directional terms and key identifiers. General notes were untouched. The errors were surgical. One archivist whispered a theory never formally published. What if the graphite wasn't meant to clarify, but to mislead? A filter, a trap, a built-in layer of corruption designed to poison replication, so that anyone attempting to study the plate, anyone who copied it, would inherit its distortions. And somewhere, beneath that mirror of bone and shadow, was a message never meant to be deciphered. The drawing endured, but its meaning did not. In 2011, a retired cryptography consultant once contracted by the ministry was discreetly invited to review a scan of the graphite rendering by a university archivist. His assessment was swift and pointed. "This isn't encryption," he said. "It's camouflage. Just enough distortion to escape catalog algorithms. A shallow misdirection designed not to hide, but to misfile." The consultant's report was never circulated. The archivist who requested it reprimanded. His clearance revoked. The incident was deemed a breach of archival containment policy. What followed was procedural redaction sealing and quiet relocation to the restricted drawer of the Zurich collection's deep vault. Entry now requires 2 living signatures, minimum clearance level 4. The graphite tracing remains intact. Its origin still anonymous. Its purpose opaque. But on the reverse side of plate 6, barely visible beneath a haze of graphite smudgeonage, is a single line handwritten in a jagged, untrained hand. She is not to be diagrammed again. The word again is underlined, once unevenly. The line stumbles downward near its end, not as though the hand was hesitant, but as though it had written this before. Too many times. And in the end, what remains of her is not her body, not her face, not even a name. What survives is the residue, the interruptions she left in other people's margins. A shredded folio, a redacted ledger, a boarding house registry entry that no one remembered signing. If she ever truly existed, she exists now only as a negative, like light around a shadow. The dust where a cabinet once stood. The faint indent where no ink was ever pressed. And the question, dear viewers, is no longer anatomical. It's institutional. What does a university, a machine of knowledge, do when it encounters something it cannot diagram, cannot standardize, cannot forget? It seals it. It shelves it. It renames it. It waits. If sealing fails, it redirects. If silence stirs, it misfiles. The goal is not to deny the anomaly that would leave a void too clean. No, they fragment it. Give her initials that don't match. Assign her morgue numbers claimed by others. Attribute dissections never scheduled. And if those steps aren't enough, well, then the fire was inevitable. And when her name resurfaced, charred into a plate fragment, folded into a scorched envelope, muttered by a student whose thesis was pulled, she was already gone. Fragmented. Filtered through layers of carefully calibrated forgetfulness. Her anatomy became abstract. Not her, never her, just a pattern, a bilateral trace, a repetition that didn't belong, and yet something in her resisted. Through each attempt at deletion, she left just enough to disturb, to agitate. A page reappeared, a burned spine endured. A student published a monograph under borrowed initials. The record flickered back into existence, just barely always on the edge of plausible deniability. She wasn't lost. She was deliberately misplaced. We may never know exactly who she was, but who they were, the ones who tried to erase her, is becoming clearer. They were examiners who paused mid-sentence, clerks who filed blank reports, ministry officials who returned documents unmarked. Each played their role in maintaining the quiet, not because they didn't believe, but because they did. The final trace. A single red letter inked on a warped specimen tag. M. The rest of the name has corroded into dust. But the letter remains faint and defiant. Like the start of a sentence someone was forbidden to finish. So the real question is this: what kind of institution stumbles across something unexplainable and decides not to investigate? The answer? One that already knows it's real. One that's seen it before. Because what Vienna buried in 1832 wasn't just a cadaver. It was proof. Proof of a pattern that didn't align with God or empire or the anatomical canon. A design too symmetrical to be disorder, too precise to be ignored, and too recurring to be coincidence. What doesn't fit? Medicine labels, pathology. But some things are not sick. They're not errors. They're corrections. Beneath the sealed drawers. Inside the redacted folios. In the corridor below the dissection wing that no one names. Something once looked back and whispered to the hand that tried to categorize it. You've seen me before. And so, the last trace lingers, not a name, not a record, just a letter they could never quite scrape away. A letter they couldn't agree how to file, how to define. No surname, no cause of death, no proper classification, just the line that followed her through every file and file. She is not to be diagrammed again. She was never entered into the registry. Her burial was never recorded. Her name reduced to a symbol, and even that overwritten. But her story didn't vanish. It repeated, quietly, elegantly, uneasily, across borders, across decades, across archives, because some anomalies are too symmetrical to be dismissed, too patterned to be chance, too intentional to be accidental. This wasn't a medical error. It was an administrative choice. So if you've made it this far with us, you've traced the margins, followed the redactions, and lingered in the gaps. Leave the letter M in the comments below and subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, where we keep digging into the stories others tried to seal, misfile, and forget. We won't stop, not until something answers back.